Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the history of India from 1750s to 1857, earlier we talked about colonialism and the forest, and in this lecture we will continue with what we were talking about in our earlier lecture, where we talked about the commercial forest policy or the colonial forest policy as it is being talked about, the way British, the kind of agenda which they had in a manner that how they created the conditions for deforestation, where they used the kind of forest resources which were available in India for their advantage, and the kind of debate which has been generated among the historians, that there is one group of historians, those who blame the British for the kind of deforestation, the kind of destruction which they caused to the Indian forest. Scholars like Ramchandra Guha, Madhav Gadgil, they have pointed out these kinds of issues, and there are others like Richard Grove, those who have tried to present some kind of a different view where they do not consider that British were responsible for such kind of a destruction. There are other scholars, those who have tried to see these kind of general negligence of the marginal areas, and they also in a way lament the importance of the traditional issues, and they try to locate these kind of problems of these marginal issues in the context of the politics of growth, as scholars like Ajay Skaria they have talked about. And the same is the importance for the construction of ideas such as jungly or tribal or primitive. So this kind of a distinction which has also been made, where you will find that how the wild or primitive is seen in the context of the jungly, and the others, those who come into the ambit of cultivation, they are considered to be not jungly, they were comparatively more civilized. And scholars like Arun Bandyopadhyay, they have seen the kind of issues in the framework where four broad issues have been identified. First is the material interest of the state, where how the wood was used for different kinds of requirements of the British, whether for the shipbuilding, railways, government department and industries. So Arun Bandyopadhyay has talked about the first issue, where you find that how state was using these kind of resources for its own purposes, where shipbuilding, railways, etc., they were being conducted by the state using the kind of resources which were available with them. And on the other hand, we find in the second framework that how the kind of conservation which was taking place of the forest, it was also linked with the kind of changes which are happening in the rainfall and the climate. So we find that in the post-colonial era, the wider issues of environment and sustainability they have also been discussed, as talked about by Arun Bandyopadhyay. And the idea of sustainable development, the idea of sustainable urbanization, they have also been talked about in the idea of the environment and sustainability. And it has also been talked about that how we have to use our resources in such a manner that in the long run we are able to conserve those resources in the long run. And the third aspect which Arun Bandyopadhyay has talked about in the context of the forest policy in the formulation process, where the colonial bureaucracy was often in conflict with their respective departments, and this kind of a conflict between the forest and the revenue departments in colonial India is also well known. So we find that in another issue which Arun Bandyopadhyay has talked about, where we find that this kind of a conflict is going on as well. And we find that if you see the fourth issue which has been talked about by Arun Bandyopadhyay is in the context of the access of the people, those who are living in the forest areas and which are living in the neighboring villages, and this kind of different kind of access is also being talked about by Arun Bandyopadhyay, that these kind of things they have been happening from a very long period of time, and that is the fourth issue which he talks about. And when we talk about the kind of impact of the policies, the impact on the communities and the kind of participation which was happening, then we find that it requires a lot of careful investigation in this particular context. And we also find that different kinds of phases in which are happening in the context of the forest areas, how the Department of Forest, it was being introduced by the British, various kinds of forest acts which came in India at different points of time. We find that these forest acts, they tried to see that how British, they were able to appropriate more and more areas for themselves. For example, the Forest Act of 1865, as you can see on the screen as well, it provided the legal sanction to the forest administration in the various provinces of India, and it empowered the colonial state to acquire monopolistic control over India. And it categorized the Indian forest landscape into the reserve forest, unreserved forest, and urged provinces to follow it. And it was the first attempt at asserting the state monopoly. So, if you see the Forest Act of 1865, then we will find that how British, they were getting this kind of a legal sanction, where they became the sole owners of these forest areas. And when they acquired this kind of a monopoly over these areas, then it was very natural that they will not allow others to have some kind of a control over these areas. And we find that in the later acts, for example 1878, where these kind of distinctions of the reserve forest, protected forest, and village forest, they were being created, and British, they wanted to have more and more reserve forest areas for themselves, so that when they will have some kind of a monopoly control over these kinds of areas. And over a period of time, we find that how the village forest and the protected forest, their area decreases, and the area of the reserve forest increases when you see the 1878 Act. So, from 1865 onwards, when the Forest Act comes, we find that there is an attempt by the British to assert their authority, that state was supreme in that context, and it wanted to have more and more kind of forest areas for themselves, because railway construction had begun in 1853, and they needed some kind of wood for the sleepers which were being used. Sleepers below the railway tracks, we find that wood is being used, so that is known as sleeper. And we find that most of the provinces, they accepted this act, but the Madras government, it opposed the implementation of the act on the ground that it would negatively affect the communal rights and the privileges of the people. And most of the collectors of the presidency, Madras presidency, they also opposed this act. So, we find that such kind of an opposition was also there with regard to the forest policy, which was initiated by the British. But British, their main concern was that how they are able to use the kind of resources which are available in India. And as I told you earlier, that how the railway construction which had begun in 1853, and British, they required wood for the railway construction as well, and they wanted to develop the railways so that they are able to take the goods from, or the raw materials from the interior areas to the port towns which the railways connected. And at the same time, we also find that how the British capital, it was being introduced in India with the introduction of the railways, how the money was invested by the investors of Britain. And these investors, they were getting handsome returns, they were getting high returns in the context of the interest which they would have received if they would have given this money or invested this money in Britain. So, handsome profits occurring to the British investors, and at the same time utilization of the Indian resources for the development of railways, which could also be seen during this time. And Dietrich Brandis was appointed as the Inspector General of the Forest at this point of time. And if you see his ideas, as you can see on the screen as well, that how he was instrumental in the kind of framing of the forest policies, and in accordance with the Government of India's instruction to formulate a more effective legal mechanism in Madras, Dietrich Brandes prepared a forest draft bill in 1869 and circulated it among the collectors. So, you find that the people, those who were associated with the forest policy in India, how they were given this kind of a task where they were assigned these kind of duties where they have to prepare these kind of draft bills, which could be in a way used in India, which could be in a way imposed on India. So, Dietrich Brandes and Baden-Powell, these were the people those who were associated with the kind of ideas which could be in a way initiated in the context of the forest. And we also find that during this time that how the powers of the revenue department, they were being not recognized in the 1865 Act, and so many people, they were unhappy in that context, especially the revenue department. And the revenue department, it also stated that how forests in India, if you see them, then they have been the common property in India, and there were no restrictions here, if you see, except in the context of the taxes which could be seen. And in a way, we cannot argue that the entire forest areas, they belong to the state. Rather, people, they had those kind of a customary rights in that context, and how the rights of the people, they were being taken away by the state, and the people, they were being denied these kind of rights which they had. And the officials, Brandes as well as Baden-Powell, if you see, though they put things in a different manner, but if you see their approach, then you will find that there was not much difference. And the officials, they had this kind of a line of argument where they wanted to utilize all these kind of resources for themselves, and for themselves in the context that they wanted to utilize them for the East India Company and later for the British Crown. And especially when you see the 1865 Act, it happens after the Crown rule, and even the 1870 Act was also introduced when you find that the rule of the East India Company had gone away. But you do not find much change when you see that how East India Company was operating in India, and the way later the British Crown was acting in India. So, the role of the East India Company was later taken over by the Viceroy, who was the representative of the British Crown. So, we find that people like Brandes, they argue that the forest rights, they were inherently limited in nature and could only be exercised as long as wastelands and forests, they provided the sources. And he also argues that the forest usage in India, it existed in the form of user rights, but not as property rights. So, if you see this kind of an line of an argument where the focus of the officials was in this way that they wanted to appropriate as much as resources for themselves, and it continues in different kinds of acts which have been introduced by the British in the course of 19th as well as the earlier part of the 20th century. And when we try to see the kind of deliberations which were taking place in the context of the 1878 Act, then we find that Ramchandra Guha has tried to apply in the context of the annexationist, which were represented by the Baden-Powell, populist, which was represented by the Madras government, pragmatic, which was represented by Brandes. So, these are the three positions which cropped up during the deliberations on the proposed act, and these kind of deliberations which were taking place when the 1878 Act which was introduced in India. We find that how the 1878 Act, it divided the forest into the reserve forest areas, into the protected forest areas, and into the village forest areas. And the reserve forest areas were those areas where you do not find any kind of an interference of the outsiders, and British they had complete control or monopoly over the reserve forest areas. On the other hand, protected forest areas, some kind of rights, they were being given to the communities which were living or which were near these forest areas, and on the other hand the village forest areas were those areas which were earmarked, which were near the villages and which were earmarked for the villagers that they can use them. So, we find that the Indian Forest Act which came in 1878, that how the annexationists, they wanted the total state control over all the forest areas. They wanted to annex the forest areas for themselves, and the pragmatists, they argued for the state management of the ecologically sensitive and the strategically valued forest areas, allowing others to remain under communal system of management. So, these kind of ideas they were there, and some kind of a deliberations which were going on during this period, where you will find that different kind of ideas which were at conflict with each other. For example, annexationists, those who wanted all sorts of control for themselves, and on the other hand they were pragmatists, those who were in a way arguing for some kind of a state management of these particular areas. So, these kind of situations we find during this particular period, and populist position did not want any kind of state intervention, and they wanted that the tribals and the peasants, they are able to have some kind of a say in the management of the forest. But when finally the 1878 Act was introduced, then we will find that the kind of customary rights of the rural population which was available with them was done away with. In that context, the annexationists, they were able to annex those areas for themselves, and if you see the kind of forest, the way they were being classified, the reserve forest areas which were compact, and how they were being connected to the towns, as you can see on the screen as well, and a legal separation of rights was aimed at. A permanent settlement either extinguished all private rights or transferred them elsewhere, or in exceptional circumstances allowed their limited exercise. So, we see that this was a kind of situation which you see in the reserve forest area, that how British they wanted to appropriate these areas for themselves, and they did not want that any kind of a right which should be given to the people, those who are in these areas. And on the other hand, if you see the protected forests, then we find that they were also in a way controlled by the state, and where the rights of the state, they were recorded, but they were not settled, and the state control was firmly maintained by outlining the detailed provisions for the reservation of a particular tree species as and when they became commercially viable, and for closing the forest whenever required for grazing and fuel wood collection. So, we find that the protected forest areas, they were also in a way controlled by the state, but certain kinds of rights or certain kinds of privileges, they were being given to the others, but at the same time it was up to the state that whenever it wanted to close the forest, it had this that kind of rights where they could close them. And we find that the another category was the village forest areas, and village forest areas were with the people, those who were living in the villages, and these areas were near the villages, and they were able to exercise some kind of a control over these areas. And British, they were trying not to in a way intervene in these forest areas. And on the other hand, if you see the kind of position which British they had, that they did not want that any kind of grazing and the shifting cultivation should take place, and they wanted to have all these kinds of control with themselves, and they also felt that any kind of pasturage was also under the Department of Agriculture, and they believed that it was not free for everyone that way. And definitely we will find that if you see the kind of priorities or the kind of intentions which you have in the context of the colonial forestry, then definitely they were in a way commercial in nature. So, British at different points of time, we find that the kind of policies which were being followed by them in that context, they were largely commercial in nature, and at the same time they were not ready to share any kind of land the way it was being used in earlier times, where you will find that the customary rights they were being given to the masses. They wanted to intrude over these kind of customary rights which were there during the pre-colonial period, and their aims and objectives definitely were in collaboration with the kind of industrial policy which was followed in Britain, and their industrial policy was also related to their capitalist interest. So, capitalist interest and industrial policy, they were working in tandem, and how this policy was also implied or being used in the context of the forest as well. And in the later times we find that the way forest policy was unfolding in India, we find that you do not find much kind of a change in their policy, and how they tried even in the 1894 policy in the context of the forest which was being introduced. We find that a number of harsh features they were being introduced, and forest preservation was placed secondary to agriculture. Agriculture was given preeminence in that policy because agriculture was providing them a lot of revenue. So, if you see the 1894 policy, it said, as you can see on the screen as well, that wherever an effective demand for cultivable land exists and can be supplied by forest area, the land should ordinarily be relinquished without hesitation. So, if you see that officially it was given in that policy that when you have this kind of a demand for cultivable land, then the forest area should have to give way to the cultivable land that way. So, when you find that conservation was not, or preservation was not the focus of the British policy, because whatever forest areas which were available at that point of time, if they will be converted into the cultivable areas, then these cultivable areas will be able to provide them the land revenue which they required. And at the same time, when deforestation will take place, definitely those resources will also be utilized by the British. In the context of 1894 forest policy, we find that how the forests which were there on the hill slopes, for which the preservation was happening, of which is important on the physical as well as the climatic grounds. And if you see the second aspect in the context of the classification of the forest, then we will find forest which afford a supply of valuable timber for the commercial purposes. So, these were the two classifications when you tend to see the four kind of a fourfold classification which has been made in the context of the forest policy of 1894. And we also find that we had these minor forests, where, as you can see on the screen as well, which were meant to meet the fuel, fodder and the timber requirements of the dependent communities. And the last one was the pasture lands, which were catering to the needs of the local population. So, we find that these kind of distinctions or these kinds of patterns or classifications could be seen in the 1894 Act. And when you tend to understand the kind of changes which came in India when the Europeans they came, and when Europeans when they came to India, how they tried to devastate the flora and fauna, the way they tried to create new Europes. They wanted to create such kind of a situation where new kind of Europes could be established, but this did not happen in the context of China and India because of the kind of population densities, the way Indians and Chinese they were resistant to the diseases, the kind of technology which was there in India in the context of agriculture, and the sophisticated socio-political organizations which were there. So, the ecological imperialism could not take place the way it took place in other areas. And we also find that during this period in certain regions, Alfred Crosby he has talked about in this kind of an framework, and the others, those who have talked about were Gadgil and Goha, as you can see on the screen, that Gadgil and Goha they talk in the framework of the kind of political domination of the East India Company. and when Marathas they were being defeated, then the teak plantations in the Ratnagiri, which were nurtured and grown by the legendary Maratha Admiral Kanoji Angre, that was being destroyed. So British, they were ready for destruction on different grounds, whether the economic or political, and how railways in a way which expanded in India. We find that different kinds of species of trees, they were being used for the railway construction, and they were not in a way able to estimate the requirement for the sleepers in the varying kinds of varieties of trees they were being used for the railway construction, and a number of trees they were being felled because of these purposes, and we find that nearly 35,000 trees they were needed to meet the Madras Presidency requirement of nearly 2,50,000 sleepers. So we find that the orientation of the revenue policy in that context was in the context of the destruction of the forest, how they wanted to increase the cultivation and how the land revenue of the state should increase, and forests they were seen in that way that they were in a way limitations to the development, and how so many animals they were being killed. As you can see on the screen, that how wildlife it was being decimated, and how the slaughter of the animals takes place, and how Indian princes they emulated the shikar exploits of the British. And in Nilgiris we find there is an example in Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil's this fishered land, that one planter killed nearly 400 elephants in 1860s. So this is the kind of destruction you find. These are certain examples which we have, and how the plantations they were also which were in a way established during this period of time in different areas, how they were all of them they were also some kind of a threat to the forest areas, and that is how you see that colonial forest policy it was being criticized, and how the ideas of conservation they could not be seen, and at the same time you find that the tribal and the peasant conflict is also there in the context of the way forest policy unfolded in India, and we find that this could also be seen in the context of the post independence times, and at the same time we find that the ideas of sustainable development, ideas of sustainable urbanization they are also being debated. So at this I would like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.